Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Min Kavat. While Taiwan is facing increasing threat from China, the Israeli-Palestine conflict is one of the world's most enduring and violent conflicts. We ask whether there are any lessons for Taiwan in the first part of our Israel show. With me to discuss this are Chang Liang Jen, former Taiwan representative to the Republic of Indonesia, former representative to Israel and former Deputy Minister of National Defense, and Raymond Sung, Deputy CEO of the Taiwan New Constitution Foundation. Ambassador Chang and Raymond, very warm welcome to the show today. The causes of the Israel-Palestine conflict lie in religion and territory. It dates back almost 80 years, yet the roots of this conflict go back even further. All three major faiths, Judaism, Islam and Christianity, claim the city of Jerusalem as sacred to their religions. The Jews say 3,000 years ago, King David made Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish kingdom, and his son Solomon built the first Jewish temple there. Muslims say Prophet Muhammad died and ascended to heaven from Jerusalem. Following World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British were assigned to administer then Palestine, as you can see here, and to establish a national home of the Jewish people amid rising Nazism across Europe. Failing to agree on borders, the British left, and in 1947 the UN suggested creating states of Palestine and Israel along the borders you can see here. The plan was rejected by the Palestinians. In 1948, Israel declared its own nation state. This is a reenactment, you can see, which triggered the first of several wars with its Arab neighbours. In the decades since, who controls what territory has changed multiple times. Ambassador, if I can start with you. You were ambassador, you were living and working there between 2010 and 2014. Why is this conflict so complicated?
You're right. It's really very complicated. All the root issues of the complexity can be dated back deep and long. But basically, after 1948, 4 wars between Israel and the neighboring countries, including Palestine, happened. So, and afterwards, about a dozen mid-level military conflicts and hundreds of border clashes or terrorist activities happened. So the military conflict, the war, changed the contour of the political landscape in the Palestine.
And was the reason for this because, Ambassador, the surrounding Arab neighbours simply didn't recognise Israel? I mean, Israel created its own state, not under the guidance of the UN.
Because the Palestinians think that it's not legitimate for the Jewish people to establish a country on their land. Yeah, but Jewish people think this is the land that the God given, a land of milk and honey for them.
3,000 years ago.
Yeah, 2,000 years ago. So they both have legitimate rights, I think. But they don't recognize each other's rights. So the war happened. Because in 1947, under the partition plan of the United Nations, the Israeli people garnered the lion's share of the land. But the Arabics, the Palestinians, they have much more population, but gained less. So they think it's fair, not fair.
Yeah. So why was that?
Because of major power manipulation, United States and the British support, especially the Lord Balfour. He's very supportive of the Israelis' establishment of a country there. So the war, because of the 4 wars, in the wake of the war, it happened first. A lot of refugees. Many people, 500 to 600 million people, they are forced to leave their homeland, and they fled to the neighboring countries. Do they have the right to go back home? who will compensate for their sacrifices and the deaths of their family members. And secondly, because especially in the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Golan Heights and the West Bank as well as Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the holy site for three religions. But Israel declared that they own the sovereignty over the Jerusalem. And the President Trump recognized this, that okay, it belongs to Israel. So it stirred anger, more anger from the Palestinian people. A very contentious issue cannot be solved by very rough ways like that.
Let me bring in Raymond. So what is exactly the picture in terms of who controls West Bank, who controls Gaza, if you could outline for us?
Right, in terms of territory, it's noteworthy that from the start there is international involvement actually in accordance to 1947, the partition of Palestine. There's a confirmation of the two-state solution to that problem. And also in 1967, the Green Line, the making the boundaries of the two states, one for the Jewish people, one for the Palestinian people, concrete. And those are the decisions made by international involvement, including UN systems. And that was also recorded in later agreement between the Palestinian people and the Israeli people and the other powers. So in terms of the West Bank, that in terms of the occupied territories, where the Israeli acquired through war with their Arab nations, neighbors, and also through the in excess of the delimited international delimited boundaries, that should be, there's certain rules to be observed. So in terms of territory, there's a strong element of international involvement from the start, and also with that, the application of international law principles.
Ambassador, so usually when we have a state, a country, there is a distinct territory, and usually it is, if it's over, let's call it a mainland, then it is connected. Whereas I see that for Palestine, there's, correct me if I'm wrong, two separate, essentially Gaza on the west and the West Bank on the east of Israel. Let's turn now to compare the Taiwan-China dispute. Is the dispute with Taiwan and China a lot simpler?
For Taiwan, with mainland relations and also Israeli-Palestinian issues, I wouldn't use the word simpler. It never came to my mind. This is a simple issue. It's a very complicated issue. But major difference between the two is that China, the PRC, wanted to unify Taiwan, either by peaceful means or by military means. And they always claim that there's only one China. Taiwan is a part of China. So, but in Palestine, gradually it's a different story now. It seems that the two-state solution may be reachable someday, because the Israeli government, they are facing internal and external pressures. They have to solve these issues, basic issues, in order to get support from the United States, from European countries. And because they are suffering some diplomatic setbacks due to, in the aftermath of the Saudi Arabia and the Iran's setting up diplomatic relations, because Iran is under the Europeans and the United States economic sanctions, and is the main opponents of Israel now. And Israel wanted to establish diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, And suddenly the whole picture has been reversed. So they are facing the internal and external pressures, maybe to take a second look of the two-state solution. But basically, militarily, Israel is much stronger than Palestine and than neighboring countries. But in Taiwan, it's not the same case. The mainland China's military muscle is much stronger than Taiwan's. So sometimes we have to make our own decision to make the Taiwan Strait very peaceful and to be stabilized.
Okay. For months now, Israel has been rocked by protests against Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to overhaul the judiciary, which analysts say would remove the checks and balances of the nation's democratic system. Protesters say the move is part of the right-wing government's belief the Supreme Court is obstructing Netanyahu's political goals. Chief among these are keeping Netanyahu in power and annexing the West Bank. Currently, part of the West Bank, which borders Jordan, is under Palestinian control.
יש לנו מדינה אחת, ועלינו לעשות הכל כדי להגן עליה מפני איומים מבחוץ ומפני קרע בלתי ניתן לאיחוי מבפנים. איננו יכולים לאפשר לשום מחלוקת, חריפה ככל שתהיה, לסכן את העתיד המשותף של כולנו.
Like many strong supporters of Israel, I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that they get this straight. They cannot continue on this road. And I've sort of made that clear.
While critics say Israel's democracy is under threat, Israel is sometimes compared to Taiwan, a fellow democracy. Our next guest, Mor Sobol, Diplomacy and International Relations Assistant Professor at Tamkam University, explains why. Analysts have compared Taiwan and Israel in terms of their international isolation and pariah states. Can you explain why?
In the case of Taiwan and China, obviously it is clear why Taiwan is suffering from international isolation because of China and the lack of ability to recognize Taiwan as a state. In the case of Israel, due to pressure from mainly Muslim or Arab, to be more precise, countries, Israel had very much problems to integrate into the international system. Although nowadays Israel is recognized as a state in comparison to Taiwan, but other than the diplomatic recognition, Taiwan obviously is a state like any other.
Can we talk about the differences between Taiwan and Israel?
One major difference is that in comparison to Taiwan, Israel was involved in numerous armed conflicts with state and non-state actors for the last couple of decades, right? And that also changed the role of the military in the society, because when you compare the importance or the significance or even the reputation of the military in both society, it's day and night, because the role of the military in Taiwan, it's a very complicated issue because of the history, because of the military rule. Whereas in the case of Israel, the military was the defender of the people and the state from the very beginning, or even before Israel was established.
One of the areas that analysts say that perhaps Taiwan and Israel could learn from each other is Israel's relationship with the United States.
Well, obviously, much like Taiwan, the US is the most important ally of Israel, and it is functions, so to say, as its security and political guarantor. And the support to Israel is bipartisan, and the US is tremendously important to Israel. And to a great extent, Israel is also important to the US. It is a bit complicated in a sense that what could Taiwan bring to the relationship? not only in the context of democratic allies and like-minded countries, but practically speaking. And in the context of Israel, it's stability in the Middle East.
Some would argue that it doesn't bring stability, that in fact, it brings instability.
I think that this argument was much stronger during the Cold War, where Israel was much more considered as a Western ally against communism. Yeah, because the Soviet bloc and the Soviet influence on the Middle East and within Arab states was definitely a concern to the US. Nowadays, not so much. But you could say, if you take out the Israeli-Arabic conflict, Israel is still important to the US, maybe in the context of the problem with Iran. I think that here an interesting comparison could be made between Israel and Taiwan, because while the US and Israel share concerns about Iran and their nuclear program, the Americans are also very much concerned about the possibility of Israel to act independently vis-a-vis Iran. And I think that the US share kind of similar concerns about the possibility of Taiwan to make a move vis-a-vis China in the context of maybe declaring something which is close to independence.
Let's explore the similarities or differences between Taiwan and Palestine. You mentioned that in that relationship, China and Israel are the stronger neighbor.
You could say that both are struggling with self-determination and independence, although in the case of the Palestinian Authority, it's much more of an objective than in Taiwan. In Taiwan, the situation, as you know, is more problematic. Both could be considered as freedom fighters against a repressive regime. Both have problems in the case of international recognition. In the case of Taiwan and China, we are talking about asymmetrical warfare. And definitely Israel is much stronger than the Palestinian Authority, much like China is much stronger than Taiwan in the military sense. Although there are very, very important differences that we have to highlight. Repeating again the issue that in comparison to the Palestinian Authority, Taiwan was never involved in violent rounds. Vis-a-vis China, there was never the issue of terrorism. Also, when we are talking about freedom fighters, although both are fighting for self-determination, but Taiwan is one of the most open and democratic countries, number one in Asia, but also, if I'm not mistaken, number 11 in the world.
That was Mor Sobol talking to me earlier. Raymond, let me come to you first. We heard Joe Biden, US President, commenting on Israel's judicial law reform, and also what Mor Sobol's talked about in terms of Israel's value to the US. Can we compare, the US-Taiwan and US-Israel relationship?
It's I think what happens currently in Israel is part of the problems facing by democracies worldwide. When the people has wanted to see the check and balance system installed and implemented within their democracies and constitutions, but the strong man wanted to get rid of certain or change the judiciary or the composition of the Supreme Court, for example. And we see that in Central and Eastern European countries, and we also see now in Turkey, in Israel. And of course, during those this so-called rising of the more autocratic style of government, the judiciary sometimes be the first to be suffered. And this is the symptom of this era. But in Taiwan, our democracy is facing other problems, like external threat, like the cognitive warfare waged by Chinese government, and also by the still very nascent and much to develop institutions to deepen our democracies. But generally, people are also very wary about their rights, the preservation of their liberties and their freedoms, and to wanted to see those constitutional principles, for example, the respect of human rights, be respected. And so I would say that also I think the democracies worldwide are facing so-called democracy retreat, retractions, but I think it's necessary, and I think the US also included, that all the governments and all the stakeholders, the people, need to find ways to forward to make those institutions perform more perfectly.
Ambassador Chang, so Raymond just mentioned there that for Taiwan, perhaps we can contrast the threat to our democracy comes from China, is an external threat. For Israel, it seems to be coming from within. Can you talk about what Israel's democracy means to the US versus Taiwan's democracy to the US?
Well, maybe the basic difference between the two is that since 1948, this is the 37th cabinet of Israel. All the cabinets are coalition governments. It never happened in Taiwan.
So made up of a coalition of?
A coalition, they have to the prime minister, they have to manipulate well. They have to balance all the small parties.
So does this also include Palestinian representation?
Yes, because this 37, now this government under Netanyahu, this is an ultra-right government. All the parties inside, they are against Palestinians.
Right.
They're against the sharing power with them.
And what does that lead to? Is that the settlements, the occupation?
That will lead to maybe because of judicial reforms. Maybe it will lead to another general election. Last year it held fifth general election in 4 years. Maybe this year there will be another one. Because the current government enjoys a very slim majority in the cabinet. There are 120 seats. The government now enjoys only 61 seats. So any one party flip the card, it'll be end of it.
I see. Raymond, talking about removing the judiciary from, as we talked about, the checks and balances.
Yes.
Let's talk about this goal, political goal that critics of Netanyahu says is his objective, which is to annex the West Bank. Is Israel effectively annexing it already?
Well, it's in creeping. It's in creeping annexation. Actually, before his predecessors, Netanyahu's predecessors, also do something. For example, that refusal to remove the settlers, the settlements, and remain on this, and even to make something to more concrete establishment there. And those are against the international law and the judgments by the International Court of Justice. And it draws international worldwide condemnation. And that's also why the US support for the Israeli government was so controversial. And of course, now we see the latest wave of the annexation, and which is prompt to illegality. And in that sense, how could we stop a government to do that kind of thing? Of course, its own judiciary is the conscience of the nation. And you need actually, I know a bit about the operation of the International Supreme Court and also the independence of the judiciary there. And of course, there is some constitutional principle installed in the Israeli constitution, for example, that the Israel is a Jewish state. But what do you mean by Jewish state? Does that mean the paramount of the Jewish people's right at the price of the Palestinian people's right? No. Sometimes how do you reach a balance? How do you protect the treatment the Palestinian people in the occupied territory of Israel falls upon the judiciary of Israel, made by the judgment by the Supreme Court of Israel. Of course, in the eyes of the rulers, in the people in government, that will be considered an inhibition of the achievement of its political goal. But I think every democracy needs this kind of a check and balance. You need a democracy. You wish your country, on regards that facing out to external threats or establish out of the blood and tears of your ancestor, no matter what, you need to see your state to be a modern democracy in respect of human rights, in respect of rule of law, and act in accordance with the international law and your own constitution. You need the judiciary to carry out those functions. So you cannot give this power to the majority. That will turn your state into a terror of a majority, which is not so modern.
As for the West Bank, this is the most contentious issue between the United States and Israel, because there are about 144 settlements there, plus 100 military outposts. So the territory under the control of the Palestinian government has been segmented. The territory looks like the clouds in the sky. Here's one piece, here's another piece. Or it's just like a slice of French Swiss cheese. A lot of holes means a lot of settlements occupied by the Israelis. So it's unfair to the Palestinians. Yeah.
Ambassador, so we talk about the settlements. We've also mentioned a possible annexation if Netanyahu perhaps gets his way. So we could characterize, the Palestinian-Israel conflict as characterized by violence. In contrast, Taiwan-China dispute has been relatively peaceful. Would you agree with that?
To maintain peaceful and stability between the two sides, it depends on the wisdom of the ruling parties or the leaders on both sides. Yeah. To us, the best situation is a peaceful Taiwan Strait, so the people can live happily, and the mainland China can develop its own economy.
As well as Taiwan can develop its own economy.
But this is unattainable in the long run.
Why is that?
Because Xi Jinping and the PRC is dedicated to unify China, including Taiwan, as a part of it.
Let's talk about Taiwan's. Last time you mentioned that we didn't talk about what's Taiwan's position. So you spoke about China's position. What's Taiwan's?
Well, it depends on who's running the government, the DPP or the KMT.
Okay.
I wouldn't explain for the sake of the DPP, and I'm not also. I'll speak for myself.
Okay.
I think we are not wise enough, or the time is not ripe to find a final solution of the Taiwan issue. Or it's not the issue of Taiwan, it's China issue. So the best way for the two sides is to conduct more exchanges to really let people on both sides understand each other and to win the hearts and minds of the people. This is the most important. You can see many cases what war can bring to the people. Nothing, only devastated the homeland. Like in Iraq, in Afghanistan, other instances. No use to resort to military force. So the best way is to maintain peace and stability, and more exchanges, more understanding, until the time's ripe. The both sides can sit down and reach a final solution. But I don't think it's time for the two sides to conduct political negotiations, because there are so many issues to be solved between the two sides. If you once go to touch on the political issues, you immediately reach a stalemate. You cannot move.
Well, one of China's prerequisites, anyway, at that political level, is for the leader to say that Taiwan and China are one. So obviously that is a stumbling block, right from the outset.
So, so both sides now reach the so-called 92 consensus. I think it's ambiguous enough for the both sides to jumpstart positive relations under this term. Although many people don't think it's outdated and it is anachronistic, but I still think this is the term, leaves a lot of room for maneuvering for both sides.
Raymond, do you want to reply?
Yes. I think there are two crucial aspects that the Taiwan-China case is different from the Palestine-Israeli case. Firstly, it's about land, about boundaries, and of course, the two states of Israel and Palestine live in one piece of land. You need a demarcation of the boundaries. But in terms of Taiwan are separate with the mainland China through the strait, and the boundaries has been peacefully maintained for more than 70 years. So that's also allowed the de facto statehood to be established in Taiwan, and also its democracy. The second is the establishment of statehood. In Israeli case, the establishment of Israeli state are recognized and also later followed by the recognition of a Palestinian state, the state of Palestine. And but in terms of Taiwan, its statehood has not yet been firmly established worldwide. It has not been recognized as a de jure sovereign state, even vis-a-vis China. So those two aspects dictate these situations. And of course, you said the peace has been maintained in Taiwan all through the last 70 years and more. That's right. But that's also allowed us to see the value of the status quo. The status quo is to maintain this separation of governance and to allow a certain degree of Taiwanese people's voice be heard internationally. We wish to have our own state. We wish to have our democracy, our state to be recognized. We wish to enter formally into the international community. That's the voice of the Taiwanese. And what changed the status quo? It's because the ambition to take over Taiwan as its own territory by the leaders of the PRC. There's no point to ask the Taiwanese people to give up their democracy, their hard-won democracy, through toil and blood and much effort, and people are enjoying that. We quarrel with each other, we fight, but within our own system of governance in a peaceful manner. And we enjoy our freedoms, we enjoy our human rights. You cannot ask our people to subjugate ourselves to another regime after those efforts.
Do you fear that if Taiwan did go down the route of what Ambassador said, more exchanges, not at the political level, do you fear that brings us closer to unification?
Yes, but under certain principles that actually when we argue, yes, I'm all for dialogue and talks, but it's also very crucially important to make clear under what principles of those talks. Okay. And you cannot ask our people to give up our own sovereignty and rights. You cannot ask ourselves to be subjugated to a foreign regime under CCP. For what reasons? For the reasons that the taking over Taiwan is the jewelry of the crown of the Xi Jinping? That's nonsense. That's we are not here. I have my daughter. I have my children. We cannot ask people to sacrifice the freedom and the liberty of our following generations to achieve the great rejuvenation of Chinese people. That's nonsense.
Okay, let's discuss this a little bit later. While there are perhaps more comparisons of Taiwan to Israel, Taiwan's situation can also be compared to that of the Palestinians. Our next guest is Julian Ku, Hofstra University Vice Dean, and Maurice A. Dean, Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law. He tells me the ways the two states compare and differ.
The government of Palestine, although it has a lot of international recognition, is much less organized and unitary than the government of the Republic of China and Taiwan. There's only one government on the Republic of China and Taiwan, and it governs all of the territories under its jurisdiction, whereas there's Palestine has a government on the West Bank, but they also have a separate government in what they call the Gaza Strip, and those governments don't work together. They don't even really, they don't formally recognize each other. So there's kind of a civil war going on within the Palestinian Authority. And that authority itself has uncertain legal status and isn't in full control of most of the land that it claims to control. That's why it refers to itself as occupied. Originally, there was a UN resolution which was going to divide up the former British colony, but there's no agreement on where the territorial lines would be. And there wasn't any agreement on how that would be divided. And then there's a war, which just jumbled it further. And the control of the territory, even if the legal claims are different, the control of territory has really varied over the time, whereas it's been relatively static on the Taiwan-China scenario.
Peaceful maintenance of what we call the status quo in the China-Taiwan dispute is distinctly different to the multiple wars and conflicts in the Middle East. But right now, Taiwan is under threat of a possible Chinese invasion. So obviously, religion is a key point of conflict in the Middle East. For Taiwan, is it the difference between democracy and autocracy?
I think religion is probably the biggest difference. What makes Israel-Palestine issue even more difficult to resolve is that the religious claims to Jerusalem has a religious significance for the three great major religions of the world, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. This city, there are places within that city that have massively important religious significance. And so therefore, that's one of the reasons why sharing control or allocating control over Jerusalem is even more difficult than allocating control over any part of Taiwan or China, because there's a religious significance of people all around the world who are not Palestinian or Israeli care much about Jerusalem and how it's allocated and controlled. So religion is a big issue. So there's a lot more sort of in common between Chinese and Taiwanese than there would be between Israelis and Palestinians. I think the difference today, I think, is that there is a Taiwanese identity that's evolved over the last 70 years, and before that even, because it was under Japanese colonization. There is a really distinct political culture in Taiwan, and that makes a difference. I think there's the fact that they have a really different political ideology, different political system, is a dramatic difference and makes it very hard to resolve any sort of the dispute between China and Taiwan. Palestine and Taiwan parallel is that they're really the opposite scenario. So Palestine is recognized by many, many countries around the world as a country and a state, even though it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't really control its own territory that it claims. it has very little control over the territory that Israel allows it to control, and it doesn't control the rest of the territory claimed. So it's a very weak state that has no effective control. It doesn't really meet most international law definitions of a state. Taiwan is the opposite. Taiwan is a country, has a government, and which is a very stable government, a stable state, has control of all the territory that it essentially claims to control, and has almost no, as we've seen, very little international recognition as a state at all. And that difference is a good example of why statehood is not really a legal concept, it's a political concept. There's just a lot more political support for Palestine, I suppose, than there is for Taiwan. And it has to do, I think, with the influence of China in preventing other countries from recognizing Taiwan.
As you just said, it's the power of China or the influence of China that's kept the international community kind of out of the Taiwan-China conflict.
Yeah, so the UN has been all over the Israel-Palestine conflict, and that conflict has been internationalized from the outset. It's always been considered within the mandate of the UN. And the UN has many bureaucracies and many institutions that are involved. And I don't know if the Israelis would say they tend to favor Palestine, and that might be true in many cases. But in any event, Israel is actually the member of the UN, but the UN has many institutions that are working on behalf of Palestine, and Palestine's an observer state of the UN. So whereas in the China context, the UN basically favors China. It's effectively taken China's side on all issues with respect to Taiwan. It's kept Taiwan from getting any membership. It's also shut Taiwan out of any international organizations that are related to the UN.
Is there again another parallel with Taiwan-China, whereby the US essentially enabled, the Chinese nationalists in the Chinese Civil War to decamp to Taiwan? Parallel between the UN's role in the Israel-Palestine conflict and the US's role in the Taiwan-China dispute.
The US created the problem, but it is certainly the US intervention is why there is still a separate government on Taiwan. I think if the US had not intervened, then it's quite possible that the PRC government would have been able to successfully take Taiwan. So to the extent they've created a mess, I suppose, but they've also created and enabled Taiwan to exist. Israel and Taiwan, I think, are more analogous to the way that they're kind of anomalies where they are, and they're threatened by their neighbors historically. And U.S. support has enabled both of those countries to stay independent, or at least autonomous in Taiwan's case. And so I think in a weird way, they're Israel is more like Taiwan than it is like Palestine. But you could flip the analogy the other way, of course, which is Palestine is being threatened by Israel, or is being occupied by Israel or affected by Israel, and the Arab states are trying to protect Palestine from them. But I think that story is not doesn't fully capture the situation where Israel is a very small country. It's not like China. It's not a superpower. It doesn't really have any. It has a smaller population than all of the countries around it. So really, it's more like it's only got 5 million people, really, surrounded by 5 countries around it that have millions more. The difference, though, is that Taiwan has never really felt the same kind of urgency that Israel does in terms of military readiness.
Do you think that feeling could change if military action actually did manifest?
They're really in a position to do what Israel's done and make itself so militarily strong that it would be very painful for other countries to try to invade and occupy it. And I just don't feel like the Taiwanese have the same urgency, at least when I've been in Taiwan. But that could change. I know that's changing a little bit. And maybe that'll change more. There's 20 million Taiwanese. More than that, there's no more than 5 million or 6 million Israelis. So Israelis feel like there just aren't that many of them. If they don't stick together, they'll be wiped out.
Ambassador, so in your view, is Taiwan's situation closer to that of Palestine or of Israel?
Well, it's a very difficult question. Yeah. In some ways, we cannot. Taiwan situation is inferior than the Palestinians.
Okay, explain.
In some instances, like we are not a member of ICAO, you know, but so many passenger flights go through Taiwan each year. There's no airport in Palestine, but Palestine is an observer in the ICAO. There are over 130 countries now recognize the state of Palestine. And the United States have passed the non-member state status for the Palestine government. So they can join many UN affiliated agencies like ICAO and World Health Organization, etc.
Even though they don't meet the requirements of being a state under international law.
But for us, we have been forced to leave UN from 1971. There's no way for us to voice our opinions in the international arena. So in some ways, our situation is worse than them. But basically, we are free and strong democracy, and we have good infrastructure, very advanced in ICT, in IoT, all kinds of high-tech industries.
And in this respect, we are
the world
closer to Israel.
Yeah, the world relies Taiwan very much in many ways, but not the case for the Palestinians. And we are surrounded by ocean. The people can freely travel to other parts of the world, but not for the Palestinians. Very hard for them to make a travel through, because they're inland state, hard for them to make a travel to see the FIFA in in Qatar, Dubai. It's difficult for them. So it's hard to make a comparison. But we can self-support ourselves in many ways. Palestinians, they can't, because they are economically less developed. They have to rely on European and American donations to support the existence of their government. So hard to make comparison. If you see from different perspectives, maybe you will get different answers.
Hello, I'm Inka Vat of Taiwan Talks. We just discussed comparisons between Taiwan and Israel, or Taiwan and Palestine. What we want to know from you is whether you think Taiwan is closer to Israel or Palestine. Leave your comments on YouTube. If you like this show, click thumbs up and hit subscribe. Take care and see you next time.